All right, guys. So this is your reading of Macbeth for this week. Now, I want to, before we start reading, I want to talk about the questions you need to be thinking about while I read. What did Macbeth see that frightened him terribly? What did Macbeth decide he needed to do after his hands got covered in blood? So you have to pay attention. Our third question: what did the second spirit tell Macbeth? So those are the three questions I want you to think about while you're listening to me read. This is be part 4 of the famous story of Macbeth by Shakespeare. All right, so here is the book I've been reading from this whole time. All right, so the last time, remember, he had murdered the king, and recall the witches had told him that he would be king, actually. There they separated, Malcolm riding on southwards, Donalbain turning west to seek safety in Ireland. Banquo also was deeply troubled, for he began to suspect where the guilt for the murder really lay, and he feared not only for himself, but for his young son Fleance. But for the moment he held his peace and followed the others into the hall. Now that Malcolm and Donalbain had fled, Macbeth claimed the crown, and he was so fierce and so strong that his fellow thanes did not dare to oppose him. So claim the crown, so he is king, that is true. Indeed, they joined in his coronation and agreed to serve him as faithfully as they had formerly served Duncan. So now he was king, as the witches had foretold. Their prophecy made on the night of the wind and the storm following the battle had come true. Having got his heart's desire, you would think Macbeth would now be happy. But he would not rest content, for he remembered how the witches had promised that Banquo would be the father to a whole line of kings, and the thoughts of this burned inside him and led him to commit his second crime. He invited all the thanes to a feast like the one he gave the night he murdered Duncan, and among the guests would be Banquo and his son Fleance. Indeed, Banquo must be the guest of honor and sit next to Lady Macbeth, to show how much he was loved and admired. The invitation to Banquo and Fleance was really a trick, for Macbeth had hired 2 murderers to lie in wait for them as they rode through the darkness and stabbed them as they passed. But the witches knew all he was thinking and spoiled his wicked plan. They also were waiting beside the track where Banquo and Fleance must ride, and when the murderers sprang out with their daggers drawn, one of the witches seized Fleance and dragged him away just as the dagger was slashing at his throat. So only Banquo was stabbed, and Fleance escaped. And now, to crown their mischief, they led Banquo's ghost, still dripping with blood, to join the guests at the feast. Indeed, they took some of the blood from his wounds, and while the guests were gathering, glided unseen into the hall and smeared on the arms of Banquo's chair. The trumpeters had blown a flourish, and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, dressed in their royal robes, were about to drink the health of their guests when one of the murderers appeared in the shadows. He had come to tell Macbeth that Banquo was well and truly dead, with 20 stab wounds in his body, but that Fleance had escaped. So although he himself had died, Banquo might still turn out to be the father to a line of future kings, which was Macbeth's greatest fear. Lady Macbeth wondered who her husband was talking to in the shadows, and she called him to the table. The wine cups had been filled, and the guests were waiting to drink his health. So Macbeth sent the murderer away and returned to drink a welcome to his fellow thanes and their wives. How sad it is, he said, that our dear friend Banquo cannot be with us. No matter, we will remember him in his absence. Let the cups be raised, and let us with him long life and happiness. As they raised their cups, Macbeth turned to Banquo's place at the table. A moment ago it was empty. Now his ghost sat there, deathly white and streaming with blood, nodding his head as if to say, "Yes, it is I, your dear friend Banquo, and see what you have done to me." At this horrible sight, the cup fell from Macbeth's hand and crashed to the floor. He screamed at the ghost to go away. For the moment it vanished, and he tried to collect himself. Then it appeared again, and he was almost out of his mind with fear and horror, and behaved so wildly that the feast broke up and the guests hurriedly departed, astonished at what happened. They had seen no ghost. To them, Banquo's place at the table had remained empty. It seemed to them that Macbeth had suddenly gone out of his mind. When all the guests had gone, Macbeth tried to calm himself, but he could not take his eyes off Banquo's chair. Had it really been a ghost sitting there, or was it only his imagination? At last, to prove he was no longer afraid, he went to the chair and sat in it, resting his hands on the two arms and gripping them firmly with his fingers. Yes, the chair was solid, and the table was solid, and the flagstones beneath his feet were solid. There had been no ghost. His imagination had been playing tricks with him. But suddenly he felt his fingers wet and sticky, and when he lifted them from the chair, there was blood on them. So Banquo's ghost really had been sitting there, bleeding from the gashes in his necks and arms. When he saw this, Macbeth was overcome with horror, and when he held out his blood-stained hands to his wife, she was horrified too. In the ordinary way, she would have tried to comfort him, adding her strength to his, she had so often done in the past. Now she was at a breaking point and could not help him. So when he told her what he meant to do the next day, she did not protest. Tomorrow, he said, I will go to the witches and force them to tell me more. I am too deep in sin to ever be forgiven, but at least I shall know what dangers I have to face in the future. So without knowing it, he was running for help to the creatures who had been planning his ruin from the very beginning. Wrapping his cloak around him, he rode out onto the moorland to find them. For ordinary people, their cave would have been impossible to discover. They themselves guided him along the twisting moorland paths until he suddenly found himself at its entrance. As he plunged down the rocky steps, he could already hear them chanting one of their songs they threw into their cauldron for the horrible things they had been collecting that day. Gathering all his courage, Macbeth silenced them and demanded to know their deepest secrets. Could they show him what the future held in store for him? How could he be sure that the fates were on his side instead on the side of his foes? From their cauldron, the witches called up 3 spirits, all of who gave Macbeth the very advice he felt he needed to comfort and reassure him. The first spirit was in the shape of a man's head floating in the steam. In a deep voice, he told Macbeth that Macduff would prove to be his deadliest enemy and that he must at all costs beware of him. Then it sank back into the cauldron. The second spirit, a naked, blood-stained child, assured him that no man born of women would ever harm him. And why should he question the word born? How could he know that behind that simple word lay the wickedest trick the witches had ever played? The third spirit was another child, holding the branch of a tree as if sheltering behind it, and telling Macbeth that he could never be beaten until Burnham Wood came to Dunsinane. And that only made him laugh, for Burnham and Dunsinane were more than 20 miles apart, and only a fool would pretend that trees could uproot themselves and move. All this so raised his confidence that Macbeth had dared to ask the question that had been haunting him for so long. Was it true the children of Banquo and their children, on and on down the ages, would eventually become the kings of Scotland? Had he committed such fearful crimes only for their sake? The question was followed by a strange, unearthly music and a mutter of distant thunder. Then a procession of 8 spirits came slowly and silently from the black of the cavern, all dressed as kings and wearing royal crowns. Last of all came Banquo, still bleeding and deathly pale, but smiling and happy because he knew he had not died in vain. His sons and grandsons would one day wear the crown, just as the witches had foretold. At this sight, Macbeth turned away and rushed out into the night. So let me give you the questions one more time before I shut this off. So our first question is, what did Macbeth see that frightened him horribly in the beginning? In the beginning. Whom did Macbeth decide he needed to visit after he found his hands to be blood-stained from the chair? Thirdly, what did the second spirit tell him? What was the big thing with the second spirit? He told him something. All right, guys. So that's our fourth part of Macbeth. So those are your questions. I will type them up for you.